Hello, my name is Captain Dan Hanley. I currently serve as Director and International Public Spokesperson for a global grassroots effort called 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers, whose website is at 911pilots.org and YouTube channel at 911 Pilots. The purpose of our organization is to show that there were no Muslim hijackers at the controls of the 9/11 aircraft, but that the aircraft were electronically hijacked and remotely controlled through employment of a system called the uninterruptible autopilot that enables a remote source to take complete control of the aircraft's autopilot and flight management computer and fly the aircraft towards its target. Now, once engaged, the system cannot be disconnected by the pilots. The pilots and passengers are along for the ride. So today I have with me a friend of mine and a fellow 9/11 whistleblower named Aidan Monaghan. He lives in Las Vegas, Nevada. Thank you for joining us, Aidan. Anyhow, he's an author and 9/11 investigator and a whistleblower, as I mentioned. And he's authored a book, and it's called Declassifying 9/11, a between the lines and behind the scenes look at the September 11th attack. And I believe that's available on Amazon. And what we're going to talk about today is a paper he's written. Now, he's done extensive research using the Freedom of Information Act on 9/11. He used that to write his book. But we're going to be interviewing him so he can tell us about the paper he's written in detail. And that's called The Plausibility of 9/11 Aircraft Attacks Generated by GPS-Guided Aircraft Autopilot System. The GPS is Ground Proximity Warning System, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Aidan, welcome, and thanks for doing this interview.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Pleasure.
Yeah, could you maybe go into a little bit more about yourself that I might have missed on the introduction?
Certainly. I was educated and employed once upon a time as an electronics engineer. Lived through 9/11 like many of us and believed it for a long time, and then found reason to have questions and began to investigate aspects of the flights, realizing prior to this time that the building destructions were quite suspect, and therefore believing that there must have been some other suspect happenings, let's say, pertaining to the flights themselves. Therefore, given the absence of info on that aspect of the event, I decided to do a deep dive, so to speak, for more info, and came up with quite a lot, actually. And many suspect aspects began to fall in place and make more sense from a skeptical point of view, shall I say.
Okay. Well, your paper is very interesting, and it's very detailed and somewhat complex for your average layman. So along the way, as we get into various systems, we'll try to keep it in layman terms, if you agree there, Aidan, so people can better understand what we're talking about. But it's divided into sections, and I'd like to cover the paper each section at a time. And given that in the introduction, you mentioned in the paper that this wide area augmentation system, or WAAS, was implemented just 13 months prior to 9/11. Could you describe the implications and ramifications of that?
Certainly. For a number of years, GPS was available, but had deliberate, shall we say, inaccuracies built into the system to deter foreign enemy abuse of the system. But on May of 2000, the augmented GPS system was made available to the public, and this provided horizontal and lateral and vertical accuracies of down to 3 meters for positional purposes to the user segment of the service itself. Very accurate, obviously, 3 meters up, down, left, and right.
No
and this goes for any location in the three-dimensional airspace.
Wow. That is very
over
accurate.
the contiguous continental United States.
Oh, okay, okay. And GPS, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the global positioning system, but yeah, that's what he was talking about there. But 3 meters is unbelievable as far as determining your position in the airspace. So you talk next about performance-based navigation uh, and the fact that this, coupled with the implementation of this wide area augmentation system, enabled this process to pinpoint the location of a fast-moving jet to within yards. Would you care to expound on that?
Certainly, yes. The future navigation system was basically a platform that was intended to build upon the availability of the augmented GPS and essentially allow for highways in the sky for aircraft using GPS as a navigational aid, radio frequency navigational aid. Previous generations, radio frequency navigational aids did not provide this kind of accuracy. It might get you in the ballpark, so to speak, with respect to a destination, but not an accuracy of 3 meters. And that's it in a nutshell for the layperson. They essentially allowed for the creation of highways in the sky that allowed for accuracy during the performance of even descending banked turns of aircraft. I was surprised to find this in some of my research of the Stanford publications on the matter, for example, in the very late 90s. And that I found was of interest given the fact that some of these 9/11 flights, in fact, were performing descending banked turns into their targets, which trying to rely on previous generation navigational aids would have been an impossibility.
Right. Previous nav aid, they used to use, well, they still do somewhat, use just radio signals, VHF, very high frequency radio signals to navigate along airways. And this system enabled the airplane just to operate in free space and with a pre-planned, pre-programmed flight path in the flight management computer that we'll talk about in a little bit. So that gets us into waypoint substitutions. And for those of you who are not aware of what a waypoint is, what it is a three-dimensional geographic location within the National Airspace System comprised of a longitude, latitude, and altitude coordinates at each point along the, for each waypoint that's implemented into the system. So these RMP-like flight paths and runway approach procedures are comprised of a series of these waypoints. So I'll just mention real quick, without going into a lot of detail, there's a device on the aircraft called a control display unit that is used to input information as a keyboard there into the flight management computer. And there's several pages on this control display unit. It's almost like an iPad with a key set that you can input information. There's a series of waypoints, if you can imagine, along the left side of the screen that defines the route of flight. And then on the right side of the screen is an airspeed and altitude associated with each point. So you can put in a route of flight with an airspeed and altitude along each route, each flight. So these RMP-like flight paths and runway approach procedures, like I said, are comprised of a series of these waypoints. So if you have the precise latitude and longitude, the geographic coordinates of, say, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, wouldn't it be possible then to construct a flight path with the corresponding altitudes and airspeeds of each waypoint to fly the aircraft in these buildings, Aidan? Isn't that what you're saying here?
Certainly, to all the listeners of this interview, they themselves are occupying waypoints. These are coordinates of their locations, etc. And with respect to aviation, as you said, the waypoints are locations within the three-dimensional airspace, all dependent upon altitude and lateral locations and what have you. And yes, the towers themselves and the locations at which they were struck by the planes, for example, those locations themselves were actually occupying waypoint spaces within
Right.
the three-dimensional airspace. And by substitution, one could have, in theory, installed those coordinates into the flight management control systems of these aircraft under GPS guidance and directed them into the towers as we saw that day on television.
Right. Excuse me, I keep coughing here. The next section you talked about was common performance characteristics. And this is a feature using the WAAS and the RMP that was activated 1 year before September 11, 2001. Now, this is the use of a descending constant radius turn known as a radius to fix. Now, why is that significant, Aidan?
As I mentioned previously, at least two of the flights we know were carried out under those conditions, descending turns. Building 2, struck by Flight 175, as seen in videos, was performing a constant radius descending turn. And as well, the plane that struck the Pentagon was also in the performance of a descending circular turn just prior to its impact with the building. And many pilots have said that this observed turn and maneuver was beyond their ability. And so one begins to wonder, was there involvement of automated systems, for example, like those that we're speaking of today?
Right. As a matter of fact, I'll just mention United Flight 175 that struck the South Tower, the second airplane to hit. It was traveling at almost 600 miles per hour, which is a very rapid closure rate on the building. And he was coming from the south, and at just 12 seconds prior to impact, the airplane rolls into a 20-30 degree angle of bank turn to precisely hit the airplane dead on. And had it not made that turn with that exact angle of bank at that precise point in time, it would have missed the building by 800 feet, some people have calculated. And that is what pilots claim they would be very challenged to perform, especially on the first attempt. So anyhow.
Yes, as you say, 175 itself, the flight, in at least one video, we see that it appears in the frame at about 13 seconds before impact, briefly disappears behind a smoke cloud. It reappears, settled into a 20-degree bank, and for about 8 seconds, we see it. For about 5 seconds, we see it approaching the building. And through use of trigonometric formulas and other calculations, I was able to discern that if the plane had settled into this bank angle at 800 feet per second, either a half second sooner or later than observed, the flight itself necessarily misses the building.
Right, amazing.
And also factored in, also what must have been factored into this turn was the presence of an 11 mile per hour crosswind that I also calculated as being capable of pushing the aircraft off course by 100 feet left or right, had it not been accounted for in the consideration of the turn bank angle and the start time for this turn as well. It's a combination of two precisely coordinated factors.
Right. And people say all you had to do was point it at a building and go, but Aidan's mentioning out other factors you have to take into consideration. And the reality is those twin towers were just a little over 200 feet wide, which isn't quite the wingspan of a 767. But for those guys who had never flown a 757 or 767 before, to accurately hit, well, actually all three buildings, including the Pentagon, with such precision at those speeds and closure rates on the first attempt is virtually impossible. So, and the other thing I'll mention here is the dates we're talking about are all before 9/11. So you can see how far in advance they were fine tuning these systems. And we talk about the necessary avionics system in the next section. And in 1996 and 98, you described two significant upgrades to the avionics system on board the 757 and 767 aircraft. Could you tell us what they were and how this was achieved with their installment, Aidan?
Sure. The four aircraft on 9/11 were 757s and 767s, which coincidentally or not, both contained common avionics packages that were created by, among others, Honeywell, Rockwell Collins, and others. The Honeywell Pegasus Flight Management System was available for installation into the airline fleets, rather the 757, 767 fleets of particular airlines as late as 1999, just 2 years before the event. And so therefore, these systems were pretty much dormant for official use until 2003, when the FAA certified their use for business purposes for the airlines. But nevertheless, the GPS signal was available on 9/11 for experimental purposes or civilian purposes, but not for airline operations purposes. The avionics were available in the aircraft. So these systems seem to provide a covert means by which some foul play actors could have done things that we are hypothesizing here today.
Right, right. Well, you said it's a plausibility of achieving what they did on 9/11, and that's what we're showing here as we go along. And you talk about achieved system accuracy that they achieved during this time frame. You said between 94 and 2002, the FAA, the U.S. Air Force, and the National Aeronautics Space Administration sponsored runway approach and touchdown test flights using both 757 and 767 aircraft and other 700 series aircraft. Can you tell us what the outcome of these tests were regarding the accuracy achieved?
Certainly, yes. In some cases, the accuracy level, I think for a derivative of the WAS system known as the LAAS system, an even more accurate aspect of the WAS augmentation of the GPS signal, we're down to centimeter level accuracy.
Wow.
And all of this technology was intensively researched and developed just prior to 9/11 and virtually stopped thereafter. So it's curious timing. The highways in the sky that I previously referred to were incremented in terms of what are known as RNP numeric values, let's say. And the best accuracy I could find for this was RNP 0.02, referring to nautical miles. And that basically allowed for a highway in the sky as narrow as 243 feet in width, with a containment accuracy of 95%, a containment reliability accuracy of 95%. The towers themselves were only 208 feet wide.
Yeah, yeah.
And so these highways in the sky at 243 feet, the towers at 208 feet, you're looking at a nice fit, so to speak. Airlines at most commercial or rather runways at most commercial airports are only 150 feet wide. So the dimensions and factors line up favorably for the hypothesis we're addressing here today.
Yeah. And you talk about a comparable method patent on October 9th, 2001, which was less than 1 month after 9/11. Cubic Defense Systems Incorporated applied for a U.S. patent for a system, and here we go, that removes control of an aircraft from its pilot and utilizes an aircraft autopilot system to implement an uninterruptible programmed autopilot flight plan in order to navigate the aircraft to a given destination during an emergency. That's very interesting that they come out less than a month after 9/11 with this system. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yes, it was eventually this cubic patent incorporated into a later subsequent Boeing patent for uninterruptible autopilot, and basically allows for just the removal of control of an aircraft from any human pilot, and the remote transmission and installation of waypoint coordinates into these flight management systems that allow the plane to find its way to a selected airport and literally land itself. And I'm sure you can address the self-landing capabilities of these planes under other radio
Right.
frequency nav aids, such as ILS or others.
Well, the Autoland system, people don't realize that when the weather visibility gets down to a certain minimum, pilots are required by federal regulations to autoland the airplane. And when you latch everything up, the autopilot and the system's all programmed, it will fly a lateral and vertical flight path or glide path all the way down to the touchdown zone by itself, touching down there and tracking down this right down the center line, such that the pilots, before they can gain control of the aircraft, have to disconnect the autopilot. So I've seen it many times, and it's extremely accurate. That existed out there before these systems that we were talking about, the Autoland system. But what we're talking about is them fine tuning and honing these systems for accuracy down to a very narrow point. And you also stated that one optional feature for the cubic system, because we know that the aircraft lost communications on 9/11, but this aspect of the this cubic system allowed for the termination of the aircraft's ability to communicate. How is that feature enabled, Aidan?
To be honest, the cubic patent didn't address the technical aspects of the function itself.
Oh, okay.
And Boeing has been tight-lipped as well, so to speak, regarding any technological aspects of the patent. They just describe the capability, the desire for its existence, but beyond that, don't really address any technical aspects.
Yeah. Well, let me quote directly from your article something that you stated there, and the quote is, "This system also envisions the use of a new aircraft flight instructions transmitted by a remote sender that would override aircraft functions already underway and direct an aircraft autopilot system to navigate an aircraft to a predetermined destination," as you just mentioned. And it says a data link interface between the aircraft flight management system and the management unit for the aircraft communication and addressing reporting system, ACARS, was developed during the early 90s. And this communication system allows for an update of the aircraft FMS or flight management system in mid-flight. An aircraft autopilot is part of the flight management system. That's a mouthful, but basically what it's saying is it would enable a remote source to automatically transmit a new route of flight with altitudes, airspeeds, and everything up to the aircraft while it's in flight from a remote source. So basically that's it. But you talk about the autopilot override of pilot control. And in this section, you discuss various dates for the development of the aircraft system designed to take control away from the pilots and relinquish it to the flight computer and autopilot system. Can you elaborate on these developments and the dates associated with each of them that you mentioned in the article?
Sure. As I was mentioning before, all of this research and development was intensively underway during the late 90s and then right up to about September of 2001, and therefore thereafter immediately stopped. And the remote transmission of waypoint coordinates that you mentioned is now a common feature in airline operations. It came into being just prior to 9/11 and was all supported by the avionics packages I mentioned. And literally, just by radio frequency transmission, this data can be broadcast and received by aircraft and automatically installed into the flight management computers of these planes and ready for use.
Right.
It doesn't require any human intervention with manual hand-keyed operations and so forth, as you described earlier. This is all very hands-off, shall we say.
Right. I saw it prior to 9/11. I was on the Boeing 777 at that time. And all we would have to do, we would do one thing, we'd request the flight plan and it would automatically upload into our control display units I was talking about. And if you activated and executed, it would go into the flight management system. But it would not only put the route of flight in there, but it would put the winds and the altitude and airspeed associated with each waypoint. So that was all done by from a remote source, from dispatch, basically. So we were just talking about remote flight plan transmission, which was the next section you addressed there. And this was the capability of transmitting the altered flight plan data by a remote data link directly to the Boeing 767, 757 flight management computer. And you said it was available circa 2001. So I'm well aware of that capability, but I'll quote this from your article, Aidan. It says, a May 2000 Boeing explanation of the capability of the program flight management system for Boeing 757 and 767 was as follows, and I'll quote what it said from Boeing. It's quote, a route request may either be a route modified by the crew or a route which has been sent to the airplane from the airline data system. So there it is in writing from Boeing, and that was in May 2000. So what we're saying here is that years prior to the September 11th attacks, these systems were developed that were both internal and external to the aircraft that enabled a remote source to take the aircraft away from the pilots, disable communication, and uplink a revised route of flight, including altitude and airspeed, via VHF or very high frequency radios or satellite data links. That's correct. That's a correct assessment there, right, Aidan?
That is, yes. And what you were citing earlier was content from a publication I found during research. And what most people may not know is that during a typical commercial flight, a pilot is only flying by hand about 3 minutes, approximately 90 seconds at takeoff, 90 seconds at landing. The remainder of all the flight maneuvers are carried out by autopilots using these waypoint data that we referred to earlier. And citing another publication I stumbled upon during my research, it reads as follows regarding a 757 flight in China under these newly developed systems. It reads as follows, quote, guided entirely by autopilot, an Air China Boeing 757 jet last month snaked along a narrow river valley between towering Himalayan peaks. The airplane automatically followed the twists of the valley, descending on a precisely plotted highway in the sky toward a runway still out of sight, using global positioning satellites and onboard instruments. You're watching, quote, the whole thing unfold. The airplane is turning, going where it's supposed to go. It's all automatic, unquote.
Wow.
And this is circa 2001. This was actually just after the 9/11 attacks that this publication cited this story.
And that doesn't imply in the year 2000, it was researched and developed. We're talking here all through the 90s, all these improvements that increase the accuracy of the system. So it was long, it was long planned, and despite, if you go online and look up uninterruptible autopilot, what'll pop up first is a Wikipedia article that says Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot. And when you look at that article, one of the first things you read, or about second paragraph down, is that Boeing patented this system in 2006 to prevent would-be hijackers from commandeering a commercial jet aircraft and flying it to an alternate airport to land it. So that's very misleading. the reader would say, oh, okay, they created a system after 9/11 to prevent hijackers from taking over an airplane. Now, this system was
Right.
planned long in advance of 2001. So,
For about 5 years before 9/11, agencies such as NASA, the FAA, various U.S. universities were researching and developing and relying upon 757s and 767s leased from Federal Express, UPS. NASA itself had its own 757 research and development platform aircraft known as the Ares. So the research and development was certainly underway intensively right before 9/11, and as I said before, immediately seemed to end thereafter.
yeah. Well, let me just take a few minutes here to give a brief history of remote control aircraft. I mentioned our website at 911pilot.org, and on that, if you go to the drop-down menu, there's a remote control page. And it actually states, people say, well, you can't take over a commercial jet aircraft and fly. Well, actually, it goes back over 75 years ago, when towards the end of World War II in 1944, the US military launched Operation Aphrodite in Europe. And what they did was they gutted out Boeing B-24 bombers. They did it to lighten the weight of the aircraft so they could load it with 30,000 pounds of Torpex, which was a highly incendiary compound. Now, pilots were required to make these takeoffs on these aircraft, but once they got airborne, they bailed out and the airplane was remotely guided into targets in Europe. Now, this was 1944. So we mentioned on the website that Joe Kennedy, John JFK's older brother, was killed on one of these missions when the plane blew up before he could bail out. We got a short film clip on that. But if you jump ahead 40 years to 1984 and imagine the technology advancements over a 40-year span of time, NASA and the FAA conducted a joint crash test experiment in a remote location where they took a 4-engine commercial jet aircraft, a Boeing 720, loaded it with crash dummies and cameras because they wanted to test crew and passenger survivability in the event of a crash landing. They took the airplane off, flew it around the pattern, and auto-landed it several times before intentionally crash landing the aircraft. And we got a short film clip on the website on that. And lastly, we get into this uninterruptible autopilot system that was developed, as we're talking right now, in the mid-90s. Now, we're going to put this interview on our website right beneath what I'm going to talk about here. And that is, it's an audio recording of an interview conducted by Captain Rob Balsamo, who is a co-founder of another grassroots effort called 9/11 Pilots for 9/11 Truth. And what he does in the interview is with avionics technician Wayne Anderson. And Wayne's describing precisely, what they did was brought a Boeing 757 aircraft into a hangar because they wanted to test the autopilot. And a guy with a laptop went into maintenance control and with a walkie-talkie to the mechanics in the cockpit told them to engage the autopilot. And when they did, he took complete control of the autopilot. And there was no way the pilots could disconnect it. Once they hit a button to engage it, they tried all the different disconnect modes, including pulling every circuit breaker on the airplane to remove aircraft power, and they couldn't do it. So it shows that there was a remote power source. It had its own independent power source. So the very interesting part about halfway through this interview is Wayne mentioned that this was in the 1996-97 timeframe. So we know they had a Boeing 757 equipped with a system that was operating exactly the way that we're talking about here. So go to the website. As a matter of fact, go to the website, read the whole thing and watch the videos there, because you'll find it very enlightening that these hijackers weren't experienced enough to have flown these airplanes. So the only viable alternative explanation can be given is that this system was in fact used. So Go
One
ahead.
noteworthy aspect of, if I may, one noteworthy aspect of the attacks is the fact that whistleblower Kevin Ryan, researcher slash whistleblower, shall I say, identified that the Twin Towers themselves were under renovation during the year or so before 9/11, and found that the only floors that had been renovated up to the point of September 11, 2001, were in fact only those floors that were impacted by the aircraft and later burned,
Wow.
which is remarkably coincidental,
Yeah.
and harkens back to the potential that I spoke of in the three-dimensional airspace of 3 meters horizontally, vertically, for these GPS nav aids. So certainly the capability was there, and speaks to perhaps a unreported covert relationship between the building destructions and the visually spectacular aircraft attacks that we saw that day, and the possibility of some coordinated relationship between the two.
Right. I had heard that certain floors of the Twin Towers were targeted. Some people have done an extensive research on that. So speaking of,
And the
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, and the capability was there. And with the previous generation nav aids, certain accuracies were similarly available, but only within the proximity of airports and while on approach to runways. But what the augmented GPS allowed for was that same or superior accuracy within any location in the United States, over the continental United States, at any altitude.
Wow.
Did not need to be dependent on proximity to an airport and the instrument landing or the ILS nav aids. It was available everywhere to any user, on the ground or in the air.
Wow. And
That's the distinction between pre 9/11 and post 9/11.
yeah. But you talk about on 9/11 itself, the very day of the attacks, you give a lengthy and detailed and complex description of enhancements to GPS that occurred on that day. Can you, in layman terms, briefly describe what occurred that day?
Sure. GPS service, depending on your location, depending on the time of day, the quality of it fluctuates. It all is dependent upon the number of GPS satellites that are available to a user, the number of visible satellites, shall I say, because they're rotating and have different orbits. They are therefore in constant motion, and the quality is continuously changing. But because the orbits are known, one can therefore calculate and plan up to about 2 weeks in advance quite accurately, in anticipation of service quality. So given that, it should be known too that the GPS constellation transmits daily what is known as almanac data, and that data can be found at the website of the US Coast Guard, and these are daily files. And using what was known and may still be known as the Trimble GPS planning software platform, I was able to then get the almanac data I referred to, run it through the software for the coordinates of the targets destroyed on 9/11, the Trade Center towers, the Pentagon. And what I found was the peak service performance for September 11th at those locations occurred on or very near the moments of the attacks themselves.
Wow.
Which sort of speaks to perhaps foreknowledge of potential bad actors, shall we say, regarding what we're hypothesizing here today. It's remarkably coincidental, and may speak to a number of things, let's say.
Exactly. How did bin Laden have access to that technology, I wonder?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All brand new. 99.9% of most people weren't aware of it, much less knew how to use it and plan and do other things with it.
Yeah. Well, let me mention what a flight data recorder is, getting back into the next section here. Most of you probably are familiar with the black boxes on board commercial jet aircraft. They're actually orange in color, but that doesn't make any difference. But anyhow, the flight data recorder records all sorts of data that's occurring in the aircraft, such as altitude, airspeed, heading, temperature outside, wind, you name it, it's recording everything that's occurring with the aircraft. And the black boxes for American 11 that hit the North Tower and the South Tower as well weren't recovered, but the black boxes for United Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania and American 77 that crashed into the Pentagon, you're saying may be flawed and unreliable. How so is that, Aidan?
Up to the date of 9/11, there had been several dozen NTSB aviation crash reports that were published and made available to the public. And in all of those reports, the referred to flight data recorders always had attributed to them inventory control serial numbers. And these were published in these reports, in every one of them prior to 9/11, except for one. And I found that remarkably noteworthy, especially given the fact that these inventory control serial numbers were required to facilitate the data downloads. So given that, given the importance of getting this data from these devices as quickly as possible, one would think that it would have been made available to the NTSB, and who then would have subsequently published the information in their reports, but that information is absent. So one can draw from that what they will.
Right.
I also filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the data download file for American 77. And what I found was in the properties aspect of the information contained in the file, the data download timestamp precedes the recovery of the black box itself from the Pentagon wreckage by 4 hours, which is comparable to perhaps, let's say, finding a murder weapon before a murder takes place.
Yeah.
And speaks to perhaps tampering or false information altogether.
Well,
it certainly seems to open the door to that, so to speak.
Come on, the government would never do that.
So they say.
Right. So everything come from the government, in my opinion, is suspect. So especially relating to this incident. But you also talked about hijackers that were incapable of avionics operation. Now, on our website, I'll go back to it, drop down menu again, there's an aircraft tab. If you click on it, what we do is a photo comparison of a Cessna 172 cockpit that was a main training aircraft for the hijackers with that of a Boeing 767. And you see the vast differences. I mean, the Cessna has little round dialed instruments, the old-fashioned type, a radio, a few radios, a few knobs and switches, and you look at this 767 cockpit with this vast array of knobs, switches, instruments, radios, and we ask, is there any subtle difference? Well, of course, there's a huge subtle difference, which gets back into the hijackers being incapable of operating this system. You stated in the article that, quote, unclassified records generated by the 9/11 Commission contain interviews of United Airlines personnel who described the inability of said hijackers to perform the flight operations alleged. And one pilot stated, and I'm quoting, quote, entering changes to the autopilot is something that terrorist pilots probably would not have been able to train to or been able to do. Even United senior pilots who instructs on how to do that said that he always has to pause before he makes such corrections to make sure to remember how to enter the change. So let me just mention, these guys had never flown a 757 or 767 aircraft in their life. And I flew Cessnas back in the late 60s as a civilian pilot. And I also flew the Boeing 757 and 767. And I can attest to the fact that there's no way they could have operated the system. And don't just take my word for it. Again, go to our website at 911pilots.org, and there's a pilot interviews tab. And all we have on there right now are 10 pilot interviews, but they all agree with what I just stated. So you have any comments on that, Aidan?
Certainly, yeah. As I said, or shall we say, speaking to the quote you mentioned, it was a United senior pilot, a trainer, and somebody who admitted they had to stop and think about what they were doing. And we're supposed to believe, however, that these amateurs on the first try under tremendously stressful conditions were able to precisely do what is alleged. And in addition to flying so perfectly, for example, if one looks at the video I mentioned earlier of Flight 175, there are a number of them, but several in particular allow for the viewer to see what appears to be perfectly coordinated turns. These pilots were not just steering a control yoke, but were also using foot pedals to operate the rudder to allow for coordinated turns that prevented the tail of the aircraft from swaying left or right too far in what is known as a skid, and instead we're flying perfectly coordinated turns, which just speaks to either very experienced human pilot operators or automated control of these aircraft. I don't know if maybe you want to speak to more to that.
That's exactly what I was going to say, what you just said. So, and talking about the accuracy required to fly these patterns, like I said, people say all they had to do is point it at the twin towers and go. Well, we already mentioned that they're 208 feet wide only, which is really
Correct.
a tiny sliver of concrete and steel that protruded out of the ground in Manhattan. And these guys, well, there's questions whether or not they could have achieved the speeds that they did, but if you believe the government again, they were operating at least 500 miles an hour more, flying at that closure rate into these buildings to precisely hit them that way. We say on our website that it would be akin to having driven your family car for a year and then climbing into a huge semi-tractor 18-wheeler truck, get it up to a very high speed and try to drive it to a garage without scraping the sides of the truck, or getting into a Formula One race car you never drove before, getting it on the track with 1 year driving experience, get it up at 200 miles an hour and keeping it on the track. That's how accurate, that's how ridiculous the story is that these guys did what they did. So
yeah, the remarkable accuracy can actually be established trigonometrically. We know, as I said, from certain data provided from the videos, we know, for example, the plane was banked at 20 degrees during 5 of its last 8 seconds of flight. And using trigonometric calculations, we know that once it banked from 20 to 38 degrees up to impact, that final twist only provided 20 additional feet toward the building center. So therefore, without that turn, even from a 1.5 mile distance when the 20-degree banked turn began, that was enough to take the plane into the target as we saw. And what I believe that final twist 3 seconds before impact, what purpose it may have served was creating for the observer an appearance of human control of the airplane, because there were many media reports of what were being alleged as the hijacker pilots, desperately trying to keep the plane on course and therefore carrying out this final twist prior to impact. And as I said, it served no purpose in terms of mission accomplishment, but what instead it did appear to do was create for the observer an appearance of human control or active human control of the plane.
yeah, well, let me mention one thing. 9/11 pilot whistleblowers, I said the purpose was But basically, we're not saying what happened on 9/11. We're saying what could not have happened, and that we're saying the hijackers weren't qualified on the aircraft. They weren't experienced enough to have flown these profiles. So the only viable alternative explanation was the use of this system. Now, I'm sure we've got no planers, people that believe there were no planes on 9/11 will be outraged at this recording, but 9/11 pilot whistleblowers has a very narrow scope in its purpose. We don't talk about the Pennsylvania crash, whether there was an airplane there or it blew up in the sky or whatever. We don't talk about the Twin Towers, whether there were planes or no planes, and we don't talk about the missile hitting the Pentagon versus American 77. So we don't talk about any of that. It's a very narrow scope. And because we do say the plausibility of this system being used is the only viable explanation, that's why we're going into this long dissertation to explain to you that this system was available before 9/11. So in conclusion, the information that you have in this paper to me, and I'm sure anybody that'll read it, amply demonstrates that the existence of this technology prior to 9/11 strongly supports the plausibility of the 9/11 aircraft being electronically hijacked and remotely controlled with the termination of radio communication to enable the aircraft to be flown into the building that day. And we ask you who are listening to this, to be the judge of that after weighing all the information we just gave you. And I said we were just going to cover this paper on the plausibility, but Aidan and I actually authored another paper that has to do with the jamming of the radar transponders. Now, the transponder is that equipment on board an aircraft that enables the air traffic controller to see a blip on his radar screen with the altitude and airspeed associated with the aircraft with their aircraft flight number on it. And the title of this article was Implications of September 11 Flight Transponder Activity. So you talk about United, excuse me again, you talk about United Flight 175 that hit the South Tower, that the transponder was continuously activated, where as on the other three aircraft, it was terminated. So would you, and you also talk about the Mode S transponder and TCAS, which is something called the Terminal Collision Avoidance System. Now that system is used mainly in the terminal airport when you're coming in for a landing or taking off. And it enables you to see on a screen other aircraft that are around you. So, and it would give you evasive maneuver instructions to avoid a mid-air collision. So you said, can you go into that a little bit, Aidan? Because I read the article, I just got a few notes written here about it, but can you tell us more about what you wrote there?
Certainly, yes. With each Mode S transponder contained within its broadcast information to air traffic control and other flights, contained in that information is also a unique 24-bit ICAO identification code. It's a static, it's static data, unchangeable. However, military craft are known to have a capability for changing that information at will. With respect to the 4 transponder operations that day, as you said, 3 of the 4 transponders were inactive, either disabled, turned off, or something else. However, Flight 175s remained on. For years, many have wondered why did that particular flight's transponder continue to broadcast, even though it was altered information, incorrect information, it was still nevertheless broadcasting. And what one finds is when they examine all of the flights, that only Flight 175 was in danger of 2 potential midair collisions. But the fact that its transponder had remained on allowed these other aircraft through the TCAS systems you mentioned to be aware of it and take evasive maneuvers to avoid collisions with it. So therefore, the transponder being on actually facilitated Flight 175's impact with the Trade Center 2 building, because without it, it may have collided with one of these airplanes and therefore changed history. Just before 9/11, about half a year, 6 months or so before 9/11, there were unusual reports of transponders like those in the aircraft of 9/11, the Mode S transponders, the 767 planes, having their transponder broadcasts jammed, shall we say. It's known, for example, in the literature that two transponders with identical 24-bit ICAO ID codes within the same air traffic space can necessarily cancel each other out and therefore cause both aircraft and their secondary radar data to drop from air traffic control screens.
Oh, that would explain why they disappeared then.
Potentially, and as we know, there were multiple war games in the skies of the Northeast United States on the morning of 9/11, including a communications platform known as the E-4B aircraft. And as I said, what was described in France was eventually attributed to military exercises as being a potential cause for the commercial aviation aircraft having their transponder broadcasts jammed and subsequently dropping from air traffic control screens.
Wow. And you mentioned here the source documents that you went after with the Freedom of Information Act was heavily redacted. I can't imagine the government trying to hide anything there. Do you, Aidan?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Oh, it seems to be standard practice, regardless of agency, even up to this day.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, you have any closing comments you want to make before we sign off here?
Just to summarize, as I mentioned earlier, most people may not realize that most commercial flights are under computer control 95% or more of the time that they're in flight, and rely on the avionics and radio frequency navigation aids that we speak of. They
Right.
only came into existence and development just before 9/11, and that timing itself is quite curious, as cited earlier.
Well, me and my fellow pilots agree on this, that, the bulk of the global population fell for the official story as far as these guys flying the airplane into buildings. And as a pilot, you have to kind of wonder why they did, given that they were inexperienced and knowing that this system existed on the airplane. And the only reasonable explanation we can come up with is most people aren't pilots. A very small percentage of the global population are, and they cannot conceive of the absurdity of this ludicrous notion that these pilots, these would-be hijackers, flew these airplanes. So that's the reason. I mean, the media and the government came out and said, we already know who did it. We found the passport. We found a bandana. We found manuals in Muhammad Atta's car. So everybody bought into it. Everybody was too shocked about the event. They said, look, they had flight training in the United States, so they were pilots. Oh, that's not true. I mean, they did have flight training. I'll give them that much, but they
The
weren't.
official story, forgive me, continue.
Go ahead. That's all I was going to say.
I was just going to say the official story itself is simply an unproven allegation. There are no confessions. There are no eyewitnesses to the hijackers at the controls. There were no fingerprints of their presence on the flight decks of these aircraft. The radio broadcasts attributed to them could have been made by anyone capable of operating on that frequency. We have the black boxes with no inventory control serial numbers. We have data file timestamp discrepancies that contradict the official claims. In summary, the official story with respect to the flights is an unproven allegation.
Right. Well, this is sort of getting off the topic, but it isn't. we talk about the Pentagon profile performed by a 29-year-old Saudi Arabian hijacker named Hani Hanjour, okay? He performed this wild maneuver at 500 knots, arrived precisely at ground level to strike without striking the surface at 500 knots to precisely hit the Pentagon. Everybody questions his capabilities, but this guy arrived in the States in the mid-90s, took some training, was such a poor student that when he returned shortly before 9/11, the school that he was training in before wouldn't even take him because he was such a poor student, they didn't want to waste assets on him. And if you go to our website again, we profile the hijackers, and he's the first one we profile because he's the smoking gun amongst them. So the next person I'm going to interview is another author investigator named Mark Gaffney, and he wrote a paper that appeared in Global Research in July 2009 that was entitled, let me think about it for a minute, How the FBI and 9/11 Commission Suppressed Key Evidence in the Investigation of Hani Hanjour and American Flight 77. And in this article, it states that 1 month prior to 9/11, Hani Hanjour went to the Freeway Airport in Maryland and tried to rent a Cessna 172, and they wouldn't rent it to him because he couldn't fly the airplane. So I talked last month with the FAA instructor that refused to rent him the airplane. He said, well, I didn't fly with him. Two other instructors did that we're trying to get a hold of right now, but to interview him. But he said they flew between the two of them 3 flights and came to me and said he can't fly. Well, why didn't something like that appear in the 9/11 Commission final report? Well, 3 days later, Hani Hanjour goes down the street to Congressional Air Charter, supposedly rents an airplane and goes up with an instructor named Eddie Shalev. And Eddie Shalev came back and told a gentleman from the 9/11 Commission, he wasn't on it, that he was a good pilot. So you've got 3 pilots saying he was a poor pilot, he couldn't fly 172, 1 pilot that said he could. Well, Eddie Shalev, it turns out, was an Israeli who served in the Israeli Defense Force, who was never vetted. And the 9/11 Commission took his testimony that he didn't testify before the 9/11 Commission. He just told this gent he's a good pilot. And that appeared as just a footnote on the 9/11 Commission final report, and it never made in. And one of the instructors that flew with him, Ben Connor, was interviewed, and he said he expected the call to come from the 9/11 Commission, which never did. So it was a FBI and 9/11 Commission totally suppressing this super important issue of Hani Hanjour's ability to fly an airplane. So I'll be interviewing Mark Gaffney on our next interview here, and he can go into more detail than that. But that's about all I have. If you don't have anything else, Aidan.
Just speaking to Hanjour's flight of 77, just going back to the capabilities of the avionics packages and GPS servers itself, it spoke directly to the brand new and unique capability of descending circular high-speed turns that we see with the Flight 77 flight path. In its remarkable parameters and the confessions of pilots themselves saying that they would themselves be unable to perform it. But this is precisely the capability that was made available by the new GPS service that had become available just prior to 9/11 and the avionics packages. It does tend to speak to automatic control of the flights as opposed to the so-called accused.
Right.
The capability of descending circular turns, it's spelled out specifically in the research and development publications of Stanford University, for example. The citations for that are contained within the paper that we've been covering tonight.
Well, I'll mention one more thing. I talked about pilots for 9/11 Truth. They rented some simulator time in a 757 and replicated the maneuver supposedly performed by Hani Hanjour. And every time they tried it, they crashed. I mean, you're talking about experienced pilots, and yet we're led to believe this 29-year-old did it on his first attempt. Give me a break. It didn't happen. So anyhow, with that, I guess we'll close out here. Aidan, thank you again for joining me for this interview with your extensive knowledge on this system. I appreciate it. So from
Thank you for having me.
oh, sure, Aidan. And from Las Vegas, Nevada, that's Aidan Monaghan, and I'm Dan Hanley coming at you from Islamabad, Pakistan. We're signing off and saying so long and thanks for listening. Bye bye.